The man you see receiving an exorcism is Andrew Gold. Andrew Gold is a former presenter with the BBC. This footage is from a documentary he did where he went to Argentina to witness exorcisms. It seems like the exorcism experience is one that stuck with Andrew Gold because he references it to this day, sometimes in very interesting ways. Andrew Gold questions why is exorcism dismissed as insane while the unproven concept of gender identity is embraced. The group responsible for this tweet, GenSpect, is what you could call anti-trans, and I don't say that lightly. This is a group that is very concerned about the existence of gender identity as a whole. Not only do they not support transition for minors, they don't support it for anyone. Their organization seems to be intent on erasing transgender identity entirely, and Andrew Gold apparently was a speaker at a conference of theirs. But, in the name of fairness, I decided to watch the video and see if it was as bad as they make it sound. It turns out, it's kind of worse.
There's never been a generation that hasn't had at least one insane belief that is promulgated through the whole mainstream. Wandering womb, women are bad because their wombs are in their face or something. There's so many things that we thought are mad. And the idea that we today have the true truth, when we've literally got people in Argentina and, of course, Brazil and many, many other places. I'm sure it does happen in the UK. I think in Ireland, I'm sure it does happen a little bit, where people have a different belief that is no more insane than the idea you should be cutting off and inverting and putting your wrist through your thigh out. This is, and it's palpably, 10 times more dangerous than exorcism.
I understand that Andrew Gold is here using the wonderful tactic of hyperbole, but he is using hyperbole in service of making points, so I think it's fair to respond to those points as is. The first point is this idea that trans people are somehow a new thing, that trans people were seemingly invented in this generation, and while it's hyperbole he's using, a lot of people do seem to be under the impression that trans people are something that just popped up out of nowhere in the last 20 years, when that is obviously blatantly not the case. Trans people have been the butt of jokes in pop culture for decades, and in fact, in the 70s, there was a big movie on a man robbing banks to collect money for surgery for his trans girlfriend. This is not a new concept by any stretch of the imagination. The first time trans people appeared in popular culture would have been about the 1950s in America. I don't know when the equivalent dates would have been in the UK, but trans people are not exactly a new thing. Andrew Gold then goes on to describe trans surgeries as being grotesque, unnatural, perhaps particularly so, and he uses the example of a surgery that doesn't actually exist. But we understand the point he's making, that trans surgeries are unnatural. But if you think about this for just a second, the logic kind of falls apart. Surgery is not natural. It's something humans have invented, and by its very nature, it's grotesque. We don't normally sit around watching videos of open heart surgery for our fun, amusement, or pleasure. They are something we really don't like to think about unless we are, let's say, surgeons. If you've ever been in a debate online with somebody who adamantly opposes gay rights, you'll notice one common tactic they'll do is describe gay sexual relations in vivid detail to make it sound weird and strange and uncomfortable. The entire crux of the argument is, gay sexual relations make me uncomfortable, therefore gay people shouldn't have rights. And when I hear people describe trans surgeries as being uniquely disgusting or weird or grotesque, I think they're doing the same thing. After all, unless you are trans, you really don't have to be thinking about trans-related surgeries in much the same way that, unless you are gay, you don't have to be thinking about gay sex. This technique is, of course, nothing new. It has been used all throughout human history to contribute to the othering of vulnerable groups of people. After all, if you can associate an entire group of people with a series of traits that are unsavory or weird or bizarre or grotesque, you can then paint that group as being harmful to society, themselves, and other people, making it easier for you to go after them and their rights. We've seen this countless times in even my own lifetime, and it seems to be working once more. And I think Andrew Gold kind of gives away the game and proves my point with his last statement that transition is more harmful than exorcisms. After all, transition is something people choose. It's not very often in a society which is incredibly anti trans that people are going to be pressured into being trans. It's just something that probably doesn't happen a lot. Exorcisms, on the other hand, are shockingly common and usually a product of force. Exorcisms, a product of force, very often result in people who are mentally ill being terribly mistreated, abused, and sometimes killed. Andrew Gold is obsessed with trans people, and if you don't believe me, just take a look at his channel, Heretics, which has video after video after video of him specifically talking about trans people and transness. Andrew Gold is a very interesting case of a person who became obsessed with trans people as the result of something he posted on Twitter about trans people not being very popular with his friends and collaborators, who then said, "No thanks, good luck out there." And of course, now he gets to claim that he was cancelled, even though his platforms are larger than ever and he wields a pretty enormous amount of influence relative to what he used to have. But this video is about more than just Andrew Gold. This video is about all the different types of people who are, for some reason, absolutely obsessed with what amounts to 1% or less of the population. Candice Jackson is another one of those people, and we will get to her own tweets in a second, but first I wanted to focus on a tweet she made quoting somebody else, because it's really something. If you're watching this video in the distant future, the 2024 elections have just happened and Democrats took a real shellacking by Donald Trump, leading a lot of people to question, how did this happen? And everybody has their own explanation, which of course relates to their pet issue. If you were pro-Palestine, Democrats lost for not being pro-Palestine enough. If you are anti-trans, Democrats lost for embracing trans people too much, and that's where Candice Jackson falls. Democrat elites still do not comprehend that for thousands of liberal Democrats who support civil rights and have long been accepting of gays and lesbians, the most painful phrase they can utter is, "I have a daughter or son in the gender cult." Because loving, sane parents are being alienated for not denying the reality of the sex of their own children, and for not wanting their kids to suffer lifelong health dysfunction for the grand purpose of embodying stereotypes. The lack of self-awareness here is quite frankly astonishing, because Candace is saying that she is not like the anti-gay bigots out there. She is accepting and tolerant of gay people and lesbians. But yet the logic she is using is eerily similar to the logic that homophobes use when their own children come out as gay or lesbian. For a lot of parents out there, to this day, one of the worst things their child could ever say will be, "I am gay," or "I am a lesbian." And a lot of the time, they'll couch this in health concerns. They'll say things like, "Being part of the gay community puts you at a higher risk of having STDs or being a drug addict." It's the same exact logic, just applied to trans people instead of gays or lesbians. Now let us turn to the person she's quoting. "I have a daughter in the cult. She told me several months ago that I was a bigot and a transphobe and that she didn't feel safe around me and didn't know what she would do about family gatherings." This comment would fit in very well with estranged parent communities, and if you've never heard of the concept, there are communities of people out there whose entire identities boil down to, "My child hates me." They're very often vague on the reasons, but I think in this case we can make a few assumptions. The first one is, she doesn't really respect her child's identity or pronouns. The second one is, she is having discussions about why her child's identity is bad or wrong, often in mixed company. The next one is, she doesn't respect her child's boundaries in probably plenty of other ways. Notice how we never hear a lot about how the trans person feels or thinks. It's always about the parent and the conflict. They don't like that their child is trans and they try to talk sense into them. The child asserts boundaries which the parent crosses over and over. The child says, "Please stop crossing my boundaries or I can't be around you," and the parent perceives this as a terrible offense. So, if they are concerned, they're concerned about the wrong things. They should be less concerned about potential health problems and more concerned about, how does my child feel? It turns out most trans people aren't actually that upset with being trans. Most trans people who transition are happy with it and happy with their results and their new lives. The main thing that bothers trans people is, in fact, how they're treated by society, including by their parents. Now, I want to turn the discussion towards legal issues because Candice Jackson is a law person. She does have some posts about that, and I want to talk about them. We're going to talk about them from a very simple perspective, that is, trans women and trans men who are trying to pass as women and men respectively, and doing so. The reason why I want to keep it on this narrow focus is because if we discussed all the different identities and different stages of transition, we would be talking about this for hours, so we're going to keep it simple. People using the trans label already have all the rights they can ever expect to have in a secular liberal society, i.e., where no one's religion is adopted or promulgated by the government, and equality under the law is paramount. Protection from being fired is already available via traditional interpretations of anti-sex discrimination laws as covering negative treatment for not conforming to sex-based stereotypes, so a man can't be fired solely due to cross-dressing. There is zero need and zero legitimacy for creating a legal category called transgender or gender identity or gender expression. Everything that should be protected is already protected by sex discrimination laws. Everything desired by gender activists that isn't already covered under sex discrimination, such as demanding women-only spaces become mixed sex, or that people be allowed to falsify the sex markers on birth certificates or passports, does not qualify as a legal right because of inevitable concrete infringement on the rights of others and the foundational falsity of the premise of human sex change. And now we see friend of the gays and lesbians, Candice Jackson, using the exact same logic that has been used time and again to prevent sexual orientation from being added to national anti-discrimination statutes. But let's focus on a couple of hypotheticals here. Let's assume there is a perfectly passing trans woman. They do, in fact, exist. I have met plenty of them. Let's assume that she goes into the men's room because now she doesn't have a choice. This outs her as a trans person whether she wanted to be or not. This puts her at immediate risk of harm or ridicule or worse. Trans people are often the victims of incredible violence. Let's assume a passing trans man goes into the women's room. Do you think the women are going to be any more comfortable in that situation than if a cis man had gone in there? Well, no, because they're not going to be able to tell the difference, and neither is the burly man waiting outside for his wife that is now concerned a man has gone into the bathroom and is going to do something terrible to her, putting the trans man himself at great risk of violence for no reason. And that's just a couple examples of why this one-size-fits-all kind of legislation does not work. Putting all trans people into one camp does not work because some trans people are going to be able to blend in more than others, and by putting them in these situations, you are outing them and subjecting them to potential ridicule or violence or who knows what else. Think about a trans person going to another country that has to be outed because they couldn't change their gender markers. This is a bad situation for them to be in. But beyond easy sloganeering like sex-based rights, there are other questions that are very real, like the right to privacy. Should trans people have it? A trans woman who passes but lives in a state with a bathroom law will have to make a lot of difficult decisions. She may end up staying inside more often because she fears that when she goes out in public, she'll have to use the restroom and have to go into the men's room, thus outing herself as transgender to everyone against her will. These laws essentially would make it untenable to exist as a trans person in public life, and that is what they are designed to do. You can't tell me that people like Candice don't realize what they're doing. They advocate for sex-based rights because it sounds nice and agreeable, but the end result is the same as anything the fundamentalists want. They don't want trans people to exist, and they make no secret of this. And though Candice herself may just be some random person posting wishfully on Twitter hoping for her idea of a better world, some very powerful people are listening.
I will sign a new executive order instructing every federal agency to cease all programs that promote the concept of sex and gender transition at any age. The Department of Justice will investigate Big Pharma and the big hospital networks to determine whether they have deliberately covered up horrific long-term side effects of sex transitions in order to get rich at the expense of vulnerable patients. As part of our new credentialing body for teachers, we will promote positive education about the nuclear family, the roles of mothers and fathers, and celebrating rather than erasing the things that make men and women different and unique. I will ask Congress to pass a bill establishing that the only genders recognized by the United States government are male and female, and they are assigned at birth. In all of human history, nobody's ever heard of this, what's happening today. It was all when the radical left invented it just a few years ago. Under my leadership, this madness will end.
Notice, if you will, that Donald Trump was not merely attacking trans rights and trans people in that ad. He, by mentioning the nuclear family, specifically left out gay families. When he refers to men and women being unique, he is not merely referring to sports, but most likely more of a Handmaid's Tale kind of situation. Either way, what we're witnessing here is divide and conquer. By separating groups from each other, by making one group seem like a threat to the others, they are essentially making it easier to conquer all of us. If you support gay rights and abortion rights, but not trans people, they are courting you for a reason, and once you have been courted and dealt with the one problem, you're the next problem. And of course, I understand that a lot of the anti-trans people out there are themselves liberal Democrats and aren't going to vote for Trump anyway, but it's not you that I worry about voting for Trump. It's the people listening to you because, well, look at this. McLean, 25, is a white woman from Washington, D.C. who wrote in Mitt Romney for the 2020 election. She says, "I shocked myself and voted for Trump. No one tell my family. I was so impressed by J.D. Vance, the way he carried himself and how normal he appeared. I think I became radicalized on the men and women's sports issue. The ad that said Kamala represents they-them, Trump represents you. That was so compelling. While Trump is deranged, he represented normalcy somehow to me." Donald Trump is, of course, no friend of women's rights. He took a hammer to Roe v. Wade and happily did so. If a national abortion ban bill appeared on his desk, he would sign it, not because he cares a lot, but because he is a political opportunist. And yet, anti-trans rhetoric has become so amplified that people who have never even met somebody that identifies as they-them are concerned enough about they-thems to vote for him. That ad was apparently the most popular and effective ad of the entire campaign season. GOP strategists were absolutely gobsmacked it worked to the extent that it did. At least hundreds of thousands of people changed their votes towards Donald Trump at the very end because of an ad about a small, incredibly tiny group of the population they have never met and don't know anything about. And, of course, what discussion on the absolute obsession with trans people would be complete without JK Rowling? Yep, we're going there. You see, a lot of people are under the impression that JK Rowling isn't terminally online and utterly obsessed with trans people, posting about trans people being bad constantly. Most people stopped paying attention many years ago and don't know exactly how far it has gone, so lucky for you, I have a few hand-picked examples. Women like me are expected to accept and repeat a lie that some men are women to prove themselves reasonable. Well, no, either the earth is flat or it's not. When a lot of people left off, J.K. Rowling had some very specific criticisms of gender identity, but was trying to convince everybody she did not, in fact, hate or invalidate trans people. She released a big long letter where she said if trans people's rights were being violated, she would pick up a sign and be marching right alongside them. But obviously, a few things have changed in recent times. I'm loving the current spate of gender activists saying that recent setbacks can be reversed by educating us all more. Can't wait. I'm sure that if I'm called an evil, genocidal bigot just a couple more times, the light will dawn and I'll realize women can have dicks. You might be wondering what you missed that JK Rowling is being called genocidal, and I would say a couple things. The first is, she was denying that trans people were ever interned in concentration camps by the Nazis, that trans people were ever victims of the Holocaust. Some people called her a Nazi and a Holocaust denier in turn, until she threatened to sue them. The second reason people call her genocidal is a little bit more of a technicality. They're not saying that J.K. Rowling wants to put all trans people in internment camps like the Nazis did. What they are saying is that it seems like J.K. Rowling and people like her are so against trans rights, they want to make it as untenable as possible for trans people to exist in public life. Essentially, they want to do away entirely with the trans identity, which has, at this point, become something of a culture or a cultural signifier, and by some definitions of genocide, that's a perfectly valid view. I'm not going to say I agree with it because I don't want to get sued. This is where a ton of well-off leftist intellectuals are stuck, insulated from and often ignorant of the real-world consequences of the position they've taken. They conclude the masses have been manipulated by influences to which they are too clever and righteous to fall prey. To put it simply, J.K. Rowling is wrong, and she's wrong for a very simple reason. J.K. Rowling, alongside all of these voters, seem to think that trans people are uniquely bad. Trans people, on the whole, are threatening, dangerous. They're coming for your sports. They're coming for your children. They're coming for your bathrooms. They're coming for your locker rooms. They have effectively created an echo chamber where all trans people are coming to take something from you, and that is the thing they are afraid of. Most of the people who voted on trans stuff will never in fact meet a trans person, or if they do, they probably won't even realize it because trans people are going to be way more interested in blending in now. And if you think I'm being unnecessarily harsh, consider for a second what exactly J.K. Rowling is saying. She is applauding the potentially millions of people who voted specifically against trans people existing. They weren't voting on a specific policy like banning trans people from sports. They were voting for specific policies like banning trans people, banning an entire group from being themselves and merely existing in the world. And if you think that take is alarmist, I encourage you to go back and watch that video where Donald Trump pledges that he will prevent the federal government from recognizing the existence of trans people in any form and go after pharmaceutical companies that serve trans people. If you add all of this together, what you get is there is a very obsessive, very loud group of people with a lot of economic and social capital who are essentially lobbying for the outlawing of an entire group of people based on personal feelings about what this group of people should and should not be. And of course, in all of this, that group of people is being ignored. Trans people really don't have much of a voice. There aren't many trans celebrities, and the ones that do exist, like Caitlyn Jenner and Buck Angel, sort of suck. So we have a problem here, and this problem is not going to be solved very easily, and may include defining trans people out of existence until we once more decide as a society that kind of thing isn't cool, because every time we've done that throughout history, we have eventually decided that kind of thing is not cool. I feel like there's something I should say to the trans people out there in the audience that have sat through this miserable video this entire time. But the sad truth is, I don't know what to say. Trans people have every reason to be terribly concerned and worried right now. The situation looks bad, but that doesn't mean it's hopeless. And I would say the only thing a person can really do is stick around and keep fighting, because these things go back and forth in society. Sometimes a society will become tolerant, and sometimes it will go intolerant. Right now, it seems like we moved into a little bit of an era of intolerance, but we're not going to solve that by running away. We're not going to solve that by ignoring the issues. We're not going to solve it so easily. The only way to solve these things is to keep fighting for what we know is right. So, try to stick around. The world needs you.